Hello, everyone, and welcome to MAP Forum. I'm Nagar Okar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive project. I am delighted today to welcome Professor Morgan Ing, who is an assistant professor of art history at Yale University, and who is going to present his most recent publication for us. He has also been a Crest Fellow at the Medici Archive project. So we have a lot to talk about. Thank you so much, Professor Ing, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Of course, it's a pleasure to have you.
The pleasure is all mine. Let me get my image.
Yes, the screen is all yours now.
Okay. Let's see. I'm not actually sure which one is the correct one. All right.
Perfect.
Is it showing up? Okay, great.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you so much, Nagar, for the invitation and the very nice introduction. And thank you so much to the people who've come to listen to this talk. As Nagar mentioned, I was a fellow at MAP nearly a decade ago, so longer back in time than I might wish. And that was a very, very formative experience for me and for my research. And it made my, book and my writing possible. So that's something I'm very grateful for. And very thankful to Alessio Assonitis, as well as especially to Maurizio Arfaioli for welcoming me to the archives and giving me a sense of the possibilities of private source research in Florence. So today I want to take some time to talk about my recently published book, Form and Fortification, The Art of Military Architecture in Renaissance Italy, which has come out with Yale University Press. And to talk about, in a way, the kind of backstory of this book, how I came upon this topic, and also aspects in particular of the kind of design thinking that went into my research, as well as the making of the book itself. So aspects of conceiving a book that potentially might be less thought about in an academic context. But before I jump into some of this discussion, I'd like to give you some sense of the flavor of my argument and some of its ideas by reading the two opening paragraphs of the introduction. So let me start with that. This book is not a history of fortifications, nor would it be right to call it just a work of architectural history. In its widest ambition, this inquiry is instead a history of forms. Forms that shrink and expand, forms that change functions, forms that span disparate worlds of art, architecture, and engineering, yet maintain an underlying family resemblance despite their countless mutations. In their scalar, functional, and disciplinary promiscuity, I argue, these networks of formal association defy the stylistic and typological categories traditionally used to classify the objects of art and architectural history. Applied too rigidly, conventional taxonomies disregard significant morphological kinships among certain artifacts. Even worse, they wrongly dismiss other artifacts altogether from art historical consideration. Such taxonomies obscure the ways creative agents borrow, transfer, and combine ideas from different arenas of knowledge, experience, and practice. To recapture these inventive processes and the resemblances they engender, I devise a more capacious heuristic for relating forms that I term cognate technologies, a heuristic explained and deployed in the pages that follow. Naturally, the full implications of this project are too vast to contain in a single study. Therefore, this book will test my paradigm in the context of Renaissance Italy, tracing remarkable formal developments that traverse the domains of military and civil architecture. Like other works of 16th century art and design, fortifications were prodigious engines of creative and technical ingenuity. To resist the devastating power of gunpowder weapons, urban defenses became marvels of geometric and structural sophistication. From the sheer masonry walls of earlier times, they swelled into sprawling, multi-layered landscapes composed of ditches, ramparts, bastions, and raised parapeted streets. The terrain around cities was sculpted into mountainous landforms with dominating vistas, while intricate ventilation flues and maze-like artillery galleries riddled the ground below. My study reveals the multiple, mutable uses of such spatial innovations, charting the spread of similar tubes and tunnels, embankments and earthworks across diverse civilian constructions. In their totality, these muscular undertakings reconfigured urban space into stratified systems of observation, concealment, and bodily movement. Okay, there you have it, the first two paragraphs of my book. So in a nutshell, this project is one that seeks to delve into the minds of Renaissance architects and engineers who were incredibly polymathic, interdisciplinary figures, and to look at the ways in which they came up with innovations in different technical arenas, both military as well as civilian, by often creatively translating forms from one area to the other and back again. So I look at the ways in which, for instance, forms in terraced gardens would make their way into military earthworks, the ways in which tunnels that might have had civilian or infrastructural functions, for instance, for hydraulics, could also be reconceived for military purposes, and so on and so forth. So this is very much a history of forms and their multiple transformations across different functional and sometimes even symbolic domains. Now, as I began to conceive of this project, or as I ultimately developed the project, it was important for me to come up with some kind of interpretive framework for which to understand these types of formal and structural and functional translations in a way that would be historically useful as a kind of lens of analysis. And the term that I came up with is what I call, let's see, cognate technologies. So cognate technologies are artifacts, instruments, tools. They can also be architectural structures, which on the surface at least, often seem very different from one another. They might be made from different materials, they might come in different sizes, they might have very different functions. They can have very different functions, though not necessarily. And yet they are interconnected by a much deeper structural as well as operative logic. And so to give you one example of cognate technologies, you see on this screen, on the one hand, a paintbrush, and on the other hand, a broom. So objects that are, vastly different in their physical scales, um, and indeed very different, even opposing in their functions. Because if you think about a broom, that's an instrument that is used to remove matter from a surface, whereas a paintbrush, of course, is meant instead to add matter to a surface. So they're literally functional opposites. And yet, they nonetheless share very deep connections. So for me, cognate technologies, despite often, superficial differences, have three shared traits. The first is an underlying formal or structural arrangement. So in the case of paintbrushes and brooms, you basically see two things with long handles that are attached to bristles. Cognate technologies also have correspondent operative principles. And by this, I don't mean in a literal way that they share the same function or that they necessarily share the same function, but they nonetheless work in similar ways. So a paintbrush and a broom, even though one is meant to apply and the other one is meant to remove matter, both move matter, or they're designed to move matter efficiently across a surface. And finally, and this is something that is important to me as a historian, that cognate technologies have a shared lineage. And this is something we can, I think, we can speculate probably about paintbrushes and brooms, that in one way or another they either derive from a common root, one kind of inspired the other, so on and so forth. It's hard to know with precision, but in any case, cognate technologies are not what art historians call pseudomorphic, which is to say that they only have accidental shared properties, but instead they actually have a robust historical or etiological link with each other, even if many times we don't necessarily know at what point in history they were related to each other or exactly how. To give you an example of some Renaissance cognate technologies, on the left, you see an Archimedes screw, which in fact is actually a very ancient type of spiral pump, for instance, used to raise water from a lower surface to a higher surface. You can continuously crank the Archimedes screw, and some kind of liquid water, even grain, can be moved from below to above and can be moved in a continuous uh, uninterrupted flow through the cranking um, of the device. And this is something that all kinds of Renaissance architects and artists were fascinated by. It was described by Vitruvius and so on and so forth. So people like Leonardo da Vinci and many others like him were constantly drawing and thinking up uses for Archimedes screws. On the right, you see a very seemingly different kind of structure. This is the double spiral staircase, possibly designed by Leonardo da Vinci at the French Royal Chateau of Chambord. And this is essentially something akin to a COVID-friendly ramp. It has a kind of a DNA-like double helix structure with two parallel ramps spiraling upwards. And that allowed large numbers of people, including potentially, people on horseback, to go up on one uh, ramp and down from the other parallel ramp without running into each other. So, um, while these structures have very different functions, they share deeper potential uh, connections. For one, they share a similar structure. They're basically both helical forms with a platform, a kind of twisted platform for moving matter up and down. Um, and while one is meant for liquids, the other is meant for human movement, and the details of their mechanics are different, they nonetheless are conceived to allow a kind of uninterrupted flow vertically from down to top. And finally, they may well have deep historical connections. As I mentioned, there was a great kind of fascination by Renaissance artists and architects and engineers with the Archimedes screw. And indeed, many architects and engineers of the time like to think of themselves as modern day Archimedes. So the kind of creation of something like a spiral staircase that almost soups up and blows up the ancient Archimedes screw to giant architectural proportions is in a way for an architect of the Renaissance to claim the status of a modern day Archimedes. Okay, so um, while cognate technologies can be found in different eras, something like paintbrushes and brooms are not is a connection that predates the Renaissance, of course. There are multiple reasons that cognate technologies are particularly interesting and fruitful as objects of study in the early modern period. For one thing, the artists and architects and engineers of the time were extremely cross-disciplinary figures. People who were involved in the 16th century in engineering fortresses. Some of them were trained as military commanders or knights, but just as often, there were many, many military engineers who actually, never witnessed war. They were never on the battlefield, but instead may have been trained as painters. They may have been trained as masons or sculptors in various kinds of civilian um, uh, practical pursuits, and then later made their way into the military arts. And this was a period that didn't have dedicated military academies as would arise in later centuries. And so people were very much, architects and engineers were very much fluidly moving from one building site to another, from one discipline to another, and so on and so forth. And so that disciplinary fluidity is something that encouraged or that nourished the kind of emergence of early modern cognate technologies and this kind of cognate thinking, which would be fundamental to innovation in fortification and military architecture. In addition to this kind of disciplinary fluidity, one can think more generally to a kind of pre-modern and especially early modern analogic thinking that permeated the kind of mentality of people at this time. This was a time in which people were constantly finding formal analogies, for instance, between, let's say, the veins in the human body to, to the rivers and streams and lakes that permeated physical natural geography. People found analogies between the body and the cosmos, and bodies and buildings, and so on and so forth. So this was a period in which this kind of thinking um, about analogic structures and forms and operations across what to us seem like very different epistemic categories was part of the kind of mental universe that fueled the rise of cognate technologies in the early modern period. Okay, so I've given you something about the kind of intellectual or heuristic framework for this book. And I want to talk a bit more about the kind of actual contents of this book soon. But before I jump into that, I want to step back a little bit and say something about, in a way, the prehistory of this book. The prehistory of this book that in many ways predates even the time that I was a doctoral student of art and architectural history. Um, so this is the building where I did my undergraduate degree. This is Milstein Hall, which is the architecture school at Cornell University. So I was actually trained as an undergrad in architectural design and practice. I wasn't a history major. I wasn't even an art history major, but instead I was somebody who spent all my time in studio and using rendering and drafting software and drawing at the drafting board and so on and so forth for, years of my, university life, and subsequently even worked as an architect for some years as well. And during the time I was in architecture school, uh, uh, architectural design and practice were changing and changing quite rapidly. Uh, Design students and architects were increasingly shifting from hand-drawn design to the use of CAD. And more than that, they were increasingly interested in using more sophisticated computer algorithms and 3D rendering software to come up with often what they called, parametric architecture that you could input certain rules into it. And then as soon as you'd input certain rules, so for instance, related, let's say, to the occupancy of a building, to the dimensions of the materials or spaces that you wanted to generate and so forth, you could press a button and then you would come up with these very kind of sometimes fantastic, fanciful, complex, algorithmic, parametric designs of the kinds that you see on the screen. And so because I was in architecture school in this period when people were fascinated by these complex geometries and the types of technical and mathematical processes that could generate them, when I started to become interested already as an undergrad in Renaissance architecture, some of the things that stuck out to me most were not the usual classical buildings, the use of the Vitruvian orders, and so on and so forth, but instead were things like fortresses, Renaissance fortresses, including extremely fanciful, sometimes practical designs like the ones that you see here. These were designs that, in an almost strikingly similar way to the kind of parametric or algorithmic architecture that I was looking at and making in architecture school, were also buildings or giant constructions that were seemingly generated from sets of rules that could be applied and then ultimately create very complex forms. So, for instance, you see all kinds of thin lines crisscrossing both these designs here, which are meant to simulate the trajectories of gunfire or cannon fire that dictate the shapes and the dimensions of the bastions and the curtain walls and so on and so forth. So there are all kinds of geometric rules, supposedly all emanating from the logic of ballistics, that then generate these forms that ultimately look almost like snowflakes or some kind of massive souped up doily thing. Um, so what's interesting is that as somebody who came from the world of design and then entered art and architectural history from this world, I saw Renaissance architecture and I found fascination with Renaissance architecture in ways that perhaps my more traditionally trained counterparts or colleagues did not have. I wasn't necessarily wedded to thinking about figural elements or iconography and symbolism, or to the kind of use of ancient precedents or classical orders in Renaissance architecture. Instead, I was finding beauty in a way, or aesthetic pleasure in objects and forms and structures that when I first started studying fortresses, many of my art historian colleagues told me, why are you even studying this at all? Because this isn't real art. Um, and so, in a way, that challenge was one that I took on to show that Renaissance fortifications were considered in their own time as significant sort of creative and aesthetic achievements in their own right. And this was a kind of question that came to me because of my design training. Now, my training as an architect also allowed me to see not just kind of aesthetic or beauty in these structures, but also to begin to have a kind of analytical eye that I think is unique, if not unique, at least grew out of my own sort of disciplinary trajectory. And this is a kind of way of seeing that shaped the ways that I found connections between art and science, between art and technology, and so forth. Now, for the past decades, historians of science and technology, as well as historians of art, have both in parallel and in dialogue with each other been very interested in connections between what used to be called Renaissance science and Renaissance art, and have shown that these categories were actually not separate, but were deeply intertwined and, in fact, often totally overlapping with one another. Now, when Scholars of art and science have addressed these questions. They have, for instance, looked at how, let's say, pictorial trends of quote unquote Renaissance naturalism was deeply intertwined, let's say, with scientific diagrams such as botanical illustrations and so on and so forth, and that there was great traffic among the quote unquote fine arts and and the natural sciences and natural philosophy and so on and so forth. So in many ways, my interests in fortifications is entering into this kind of very important recent discourse. However, I see these connections in a way that is somewhat different. Now, many of the connections between art and science that scholars have brought up are focused on um, focused primarily on images. They're focused on largely flat or two-dimensional representations, such as diagrams and paintings and drawings and so on and so forth. Yet this kind of thinking sometimes doesn't work when one wants to look at more complex spatial three-dimensional structures and instruments. And so in a way, my background as an architect gave me an analytical eye to begin to see connections between art and science that had spatial, structural, um, and multi-dimensional, sometimes even multi-sensory implications. To give you one example, um, in my book, for instance, I offer a comparison between what you see on the left, which is a classical cornice made from marble, of the kind that Renaissance architects loved to either study on ancient monuments or to draw their own versions of. And on the right, you see something seemingly very different. What you see on the right is the profile of a fortified landscape with its ditches and with its kind of scarps and water channels and so on and so forth. A huge landscape that is a modern landscape designed for warfare. But if you kind of squint your eyes a little bit and look at these two structures, despite their many differences, you begin to see similarities. Um, and these similarities are not coincidental, because on the one hand, architects of this time would have pursued their early training drawing many, many classical cornices that you see on the left, like the one that you see on the left. And the same architects, as they then pursued military architecture, were drawing the types of profiles that you see on the right, translating, I would argue, the very same kind of morphologies and modes of thinking from one field to another and at vastly different scales, and also translating cognate operative properties. Figures like Vitruvius talked about classical cornices and all their ornamental details, not just as details that were supposed to be decorative, but these were details that were supposed to allude to a structural function in each part of the molding, alluding to, for instance, the uses of rafters and beams, of dowels and so on and so forth, that in an originally wooden or timber frame construction would each have had an important structural function as well as a precise proportion and dimension that was necessary for carrying out that structural function. Renaissance architects thought in amazingly similar ways about their kind of profiled fortified landscapes, as you see on the right, because every single proportion, every width, and so on and so forth was similarly, for instance, meant to maximize the structure's resistance to enemy ballistics, and so on and so forth. And so these are the types of sort of more spatialized thinking and ways of seeing that I believe, coming from a design background, I bring to this scholarship. Okay, so with the remaining time, I want to say just a couple things about the contents of this book, about its scope and its structure. Now, this book is relatively transversal. I look at contexts across Italy, but not only across Italy, finding connections in Northern Europe largely, and to a certain degree also beyond Europe. Yet at the same time, I wanted to control the subject matter of this book, turning to a certain extent to a more contained context of analysis and historical study. Much of this book revolves around the context of the Farnese dynasty, starting with Pope Paul III and his descendants, who across the peninsula, both in the papal domains as well as in their later hereditary domains, orchestrated all kinds of very impressive fortification projects that were deeply interconnected with larger projects of urban planning, palatial design, and so on and so forth. This was a context that was particularly interesting for me because both the patrons and the architects thought about military architecture in a very holistic, cross-disciplinary way, tying in their fortification projects with larger schemes of artistic, urban, and architectural beautification. And commissioning architects, famously like Michelangelo and Antonio da San Gallo the Younger, who were sort of universal figures involved in all kinds of design engineering across civilian and military worlds, between the worlds of pleasure and beauty, as well as practical functional defense, and so on and so forth. And so my book has all kinds of case studies that are focused on Farnese patronage, such as in Perugia, as you see on the left, and in Rome, as you see on the right. But these case studies are toggled with more broad thematic chapters that are not localized to Farnese patronage, and not even necessarily to Italy. My book itself is structured almost in a multi-layered, stratified way, with chapters that look for cognate technologies across different strata of the built environment, from the subterranean to inside the walls, to above the ground, and so on and so forth. So just to give you some sense of some of these strata, I have a chapter called macro infrastructure that looks, for instance, at how the same strategies of tunneling, as you see on the left, that were used to lay underground hydraulic mains during wartime, and often recruiting the very same tunnel digging specialists were, as you see on the right, used for military pursuits such as subterranean siege mining, where you see on the right a tunnel can be dug underneath a town. to put an explosive charge under it and to blow up the fortress above without the town inhabitants even knowing that there was a bomb to be detonated right below them. So here you see ways in which cognate technologies flip-flop in their uses from tunnels used to nourish the life of a city to tunnels that are used to destroy them. Another chapter called Microinfrastructure looks at the ways in which civilian, sort of more, sometimes smaller scale building technologies and infrastructures could be adapted for military uses and vice versa. So to just give you one example, on the left, we see the kind of chimney oculus used to funnel out the smoke from a great palace kitchen, the kind of kitchen that has multiple fires burning at once in order to provide the food for a great princely feast. On the right, you see a chamber, a countermine chamber and shooting gallery that strangely also has an oculus. But the oculus here is instead used to funnel out the fumes that could be generated from cannons, used to funnel out the fumes that could be generated from the explosion of an enemy miner, and so on and so forth. And so interestingly, we see how the domestic sphere is translated into a military context. I'll skip over some things. Another chapter, for instance, looks at shared morphologies and design ideas between, on the left, what you see as what are called cavalieri. These are elevated gun platforms made from earth with ramps that allow you to roll up your cannon carriages very efficiently to the top and shoot attackers from afar. And on the right, you see a very similar kind of construction, but used for a garden and a garden mount where the goal is no longer to shoot an enemy from a great distance, but to see a vast panorama of the surrounding landscape. So these are just, this is just a sampling of the kinds of things I think about in the book, and I'm going to skip through some other chapters. Finally, I want to say just a couple things about how coming from a design background shaped the way I actually executed the book in the end. Now, the idea of cognate technologies is one that is premised on unexpected formal comparisons between objects that one might not necessarily compare with each other. And so as I designed the book, it was important for me to think about the layout of the book in ways that could generate these or instantly visualize these unexpected comparisons. So what you see on the left is a hospital ventilation system and on the right, a fortress ventilation system that share a very, very similar configuration. I should also say that as a designer, I was able basically to make my own diagrams and illustrations for this book, including these. And here I came to understand design and illustration not merely as representing ideas that had come about in my research, but in a way, design became a way of constructing a kind of argument, one that could be reinforced by the ways I did double page layouts, such as here and here, so that readers, hopefully, as they're flipping through the book, in a sense, can see the argument before they even read its contents. I was also very interested in the semiotics of the book's design. And what do I mean by that? The typical Renaissance book is serifed. It has often, crimson text and so on and so forth. I didn't want that for my book. I wanted to create a book that would speak to a wider audience, including designers, including those interested in modern art and architecture. So I worked with a designer that, came up with various, sometimes excessively forceful cover designs and ultimately settled on one that I think conveyed both the sense of a kind of modern consciousness, as you see on the front flap of the cover, that is paired with a painting that is more sort of traditionally Renaissance. Um, just to show you one other cover, this is a blip that my friend sent to me. When I was struggling with cover designs, he used AI to generate, he tried to be helpful and used AI to generate a cover design for me. So this is the ChatGPT cover design. And it looks a bit more Game of Thrones than is probably appropriate. But there you go, some version of art and technology coming together. So with that, I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. And one last thing I want to show is that the book can be ordered online. And for those of you who are here, there's a discount code that can get you 30% off from now until June 30th, so into the summer. So thank you very much, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating, and I love this ending with a discount for the book. This is really fascinating. Thank you so much. And before we get to the very end, I would like to remind our audience that this book will be presented by Professor Ng in Florence. This is going to be an in-person event on May 22nd at 5 p.m. This is Italian time. This whole event is organized by Dr. Davide Buerio, who is also from MAP, and also with the support of a grant from the Italian Ministry of University and Research. So if you are in Florence and would like to hear more about this book, you can go to Palazzo Alberti on May 22nd at 5 p.m. and hear more about this book. Thank you so much, Professor Ng, for this fascinating and interesting and very lively and energetic presentation of this book. I'm so happy that we waited for a year so that your book is finally out and then we can actually talk about it. So this makes it even more interesting. So with this, the Q&A is open now for questions. I do see a question comment in the Q&A, so I'm going to read that to you, and then I hope that I can also ask my questions as well. Okay, this is by an anonymous attendee. I'm reading in your map many interesting locations for scholars interested in modern style fortifications and their development in Italy. Was the influence of site-specific characteristics considered, in parentheses, such as the difference in the design of citadels between early Renaissance times and, say, that the Francesco di Giorgio Martini, or does the study mainly focus on cognate technologies? Anyway, the topic in itself is very interesting, and I personally think it does reflect the way of thinking of Renaissance engineers, architects.
Yeah, very good question. Site specificity is absolutely fundamental to Renaissance military architecture. Not only in the Renaissance, but also before and since. So I mean the importance of strategic site selection and planning, that's in a way a universal of defensive architecture. And but site selection can have strategic purposes, but it can also sometimes have different purposes that are also symbolic. Well, let me step back for a moment before I get into that. So, for instance, just to give you one example, in Rome, the which is, as you know, a very hilly topography. This is a site where military engineers, and this was often a subject of debate, often cited fortifications along the ridges of this hilly topography, which would give it, the capability of surveillance over the landscape, so on and so forth. This was sometimes a very heavily debated topic. Different tacticians and strategists would sometimes actually say the plane was better. Sometimes they would say an elevated site was better. So there's not necessarily a consensus on how fortifications should be cited. That said, politics and sometimes political symbolism are just as important in the siting of citadels and fortresses. In the case of the papal domains, during the 16th century, as many know, this was a period of attempted bureaucratic and political centralization of the state. And so citadels were as much planted in subject cities as ways to assert papal dominion or hegemony over these places. And in some cases, for instance, in the case of Bologna, there was a much hated papal citadel planted there by Julius II, right, to control the city, which was the richest and most prosperous after Rome. What's funny here is that eventually the Bolognese ousted, you know, eventually the Bolognese who hated this fortress so much um, uh, demolished the fortress, and in many ways, Bologna for the most of the early modern period was a largely unfortified town, and it still was okay. Right. So, so this gives us a sense that there's really no linear deterministic logic between sight and defense, and so on and so forth. And that sometimes these things are more rhetoric than reality. And politics and symbolism play as much a role as other considerations.
Thank you. The next question is by Luke. Can you talk about the development of the snowflake/star-shaped fortifications in response to the use of gunpowder technology?
Yeah, sure. So okay, so let me step back for a moment. The development of bastion fortifications from walled, from high crenellated walled structures to more low-lying, large earthwork bastion structures is something that military historians and architectural historians have been, very, very interested in talking about for, centuries, especially in the 19th century. Now, in the discourse on the development towards these types of fortresses, there's often a kind of, I would almost say, a Darwinistic kind of linear interpretive framework. So, people like to say, well, there's the rise of field artillery, blah, 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 that forced, higher, thinner medieval walls to become obsolete because they crumbled upon impact. Therefore, by necessity, terraplens and earthworks were added to them. They were made lower, blah, 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 blah. So it's almost as if in a kind of Darwinian evolutionary process, the survival of the fittest principle caused certain obsolete types to die off, and other ones to emerge, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so and this is in many ways still a very standard narrative, but it's a narrative that is shaped by modern teleological and Darwinian thinking, right? And it's not surprising that it's in the 19th century, especially, that scholars loved to make this argument, in part based on Renaissance sources, but they emphasized it in the 19th century. And they emphasized it in the 19th century also for very nationalistic aims, right? The Italians would say, we arrived at modernity because we came up with the first, snowflake bastions. And then the Germans were like, no, 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 we came up with it first. Like Durer came up with it, blah, 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 blah. So this, there were all kinds of kind of nationalistic, teleological thinking that has conditioned the way we talk about this. Now, my interpretation in this book is a bit different. I think that certain aspects, such as earthworks, lower gun platforms, and so on and so forth, do, of course, facilitate defense in artillery fortifications of this period, but the particular geometric snowflake-like design is actually, I argue, conditioned by cultural pressures. And what do I mean by that? People of this time were very interested in standardizing techniques of design. So, but also different types of artistic products. So this is the period when people like to standardize the classical orders, telling you exactly what dimensions and proportions you should have to make a correct classical column. This was a period of petrarchismo, where people were like, let me give you the rules and orders for how to write a sonnet. And similarly, this was also a period when people wanted, therefore, to standardize fortifications, right? Fortifications could potentially be a very complex thing to design, but if you gave lots of rules and regulations on how to design them, then presumably you could simplify and make this process accessible even to a nobleman who didn't have that much drawing training, right? And one should also say that there's a lot of idealization in these fortresses because they idealize cannon trajectories as straight lines, when in fact, cannons of this time were extremely unpredictable. They weren't machine made in a modern way, and so their calibers were very unpredictable, and they would swerve left and right, and so on and so forth. So the idea of the snowflake is a kind of mental figment in some ways.
Right. Thank you. We only have 2 minutes, but we still have a lot of questions coming up. So if you could keep it brief, and then I'm going to provide your email address in the chat. So if there are any follow-up questions, then we can reach out to you directly. But the next question is by George Gorse. This reminds me of Henry Fauchelevent's, sorry for the mispronunciation, La Ville de Forme, from France to Yale, with its influence on George Kubler, The Shape of Time, etc. Was this in your mind at Yale? Thank you for the
Yeah,
fascinating talk.
that's a great question. Um, the idea of the cognate technologies predated my time at Yale, but in a way, happily, I am continuing on this tradition of thinking about the life of forms, and also what you're saying is very right. I think I'm standing on the shoulders of other art historians and thinkers who have tried very hard to break down categories of art history and to think more fluidly about forms.
Thank you. The next question is by Pamela. I'm curious if you explored at all the expressions of these concepts in more aesthetic forms. I'm thinking of your discussion of the civil and military applications of hydraulic engineering, and I immediately began to think of the use of the same technologies to create humorous or marvelous effect in princely gardens.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we think about something like a cannon, right? A cannon is nothing but a metal tube that is designed for pressurized elements to shoot through it, right? So if we think about that form at its sort of distilled kind of schematic level, the cannon is the cognate of all kinds of different devices. The hydraulic tubes that shoot out, streams of water, and just like cannons can be made to have, so firearms can be made to have different calibers and different explosive effects. So too can water have an array of different effects. We can even think of something like organs, right? Organ tubes, or what do you call them? as as also cognates, because organ tubes in this case are shooting out pressurized air, and their size and diameter and so forth is calibrated not for gunfire, not for water, but for sound. So absolutely, this is something that crosses aesthetic and artistic domains as well as sensory domains.
Right. The next question is by Suzanne. Renaissance fortifications often seem to be in the shape of a five-pointed star, like the designs you showed. Our Defense Department building is a pentagon. Is there a connection, or is this just simply a
Yeah.
coincidence?
That's a very good, that there is a connection, and the Pentagon becomes a very standardized form in this period, because according to military theorists, it's the perfect shape where you have the angles not so thin that they are fragile, but not so wide that you have to like make a million of them all around. And so it's just the right shape. And because it becomes so standardized, the US Pentagon is similarly shaped.
Right, thank you. The next one is by Kenta. In most cases, earlier Renaissance military architects became involved in military architecture later in their careers. So, are there any examples of military technology that was translated into civil architecture? Do you talk about them in your book?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually, see the relationship between these fields as bilateral. They're kind of going every which way. The reason, to some extent, I brought more civilian uh, influences onto military architecture into discussion is because people often think of the development going from military to civilian, when in fact I wanted to show that actually the opposite also happens from civilian to military. But for instance, things like earthworks, right? Earthworks, the ways in which to construct very stable um,
Mhm.
uh, uh, artillery platforms and so on and so forth. I argue actually that those are deeply interrelated with the development of great terraced gardens. And in fact, somebody like Bramante, before designing the Belvedere courtyard with its multi-leveled terraces, was involved as a military engineer and landscape engineer in different ways.
Thank you. And the last question, although I have provided Professor Ng's email in the chat, so if you have any follow-up questions, please reach out to him. If you're coming to RSA, then maybe we can ask our questions in person. So the last question is by John. Thank you, Morgan. As you worked on this project, how much did real surviving structures teach you versus plans, drawings, and schemata? In other words, what was the relationship for you between still existing structures and paper ideas?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would should first say that this is a difficult topic to study because often fortresses were demolished in modern times in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially because these very thick circuits, uh, for various factors, sometimes because they blocked traffic between the city center and the suburbs and so forth. Other times because of sort of ideals of open planning meant that a lot of these structures are no longer extant. And so I have had to rely very heavily on drawings and plans, as well as my own kind of reconstructions. Real structures do play in importantly as well. And so, for instance, in one of the chapters where I work on a fortress called the Rocca Paolina in Perugia, my visit to the site and to its the kind of subterranean level of this architecture was really inspiring. I kind of was amazed that some of the subterranean levels of this architecture were actually basically a whole neighborhood of the city that got taken over by Paul III and then cloaked in a great fortress, covered up in a great fortress, turning a series of
Wow.
once outdoor alleyways and streets into a subterranean warren of underground corridors. And experiencing that space gave me a sense of how it might connect with a kind of larger fascination with the subterranean world, and also connections with things like the Castel Sant'Angelo in
Mm.
Rome, which you also may know is a big work of spolia, where an ancient mausoleum is covered up by a papal fortress and kind of turned into a dark, murky, fortified space.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. I wish we could have more time, but it's already like midnight in some parts of Europe. So so we have to end. I should have apologized for my voice in the beginning. I forgot. Sorry, I got distracted with a lot of more interesting things. But sorry for my voice today. I hope that we can meet some of you at the RSA. Please come to the panels that are sponsored by the Medici Archive Project. We have three panels on Friday and one panel on Saturday. And if you want to meet with Professor Ng and other scholars of your interest, please come to RSA. We hope to see you there. Thank you so much again, Professor Ng, for spending the last hour or so with us and for sharing your knowledge and your publication with us. It was fascinating to know and learn more about this publication. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you
Thank
in
you, everyone.
Florence
Yes.
online. Okay, bye, everybody.
Yes, hopefully. See you all next week and happy spring if you're celebrating Nowruz that is celebrated on the spring equinox. Happy Nowruz to you. And happy spring. We hope to see you again next week, same time, same link with another Map Forum talk. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye bye. Bye bye.